The room had fallen into a silence so sharp it could cut through steel. The faint hum of the air conditioner was the only sound left alive. On the walls hung portraits of past justices, their gazes stern, almost watchful. But one name seemed to hang heavier than the rest: Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Jasmine Crockett stood at the center of that stillness, papers in her hand, her voice steady but threaded with something deeper, a quiet conviction that didn't need to shout. Across from her, a panel of legal minds waited for her response. A question about law, about precedent, but more than that, about legacy. Moments earlier, a commentator had invoked Ginsburg's words, almost as a challenge. Justice isn't about emotion, representative, it's about interpretation. The tone was dismissive, meant to box Crockett into the familiar corners where passion is painted as weakness. But Crockett didn't flinch. She drew a slow breath, her eyes scanning the chamber. And then she spoke, not as a politician defending a point, but as a student of history, carrying its unfinished sentence forward. Her first words carried weight, not the kind that fills a room, but the kind that anchors it. Justice Ginsburg once said that real change, enduring change, happens one step at a time. But she never said it required silence. The air shifted. People leaned in. Even the cameras seemed to pause. What happened next wasn't just a reply. It was a reverberation of everything Ruth Bader Ginsburg had stood for: equality, voice, and the power of persistence in the face of dismissal. The echo began there, and it was about to grow louder. To understand why Jasmine Crockett's words carried such force, you have to step back, beyond that quiet chamber, beyond the flicker of the cameras, into the long shadow cast by a woman who changed how America thought about justice. Ruth Bader Ginsburg wasn't just a Supreme Court justice. She was an architect of equality, a scholar who transformed constitutional law into a language that included women, minorities, and the overlooked. For decades, her words built bridges where walls once stood. When she spoke, she didn't just interpret the law. She redefined who it was meant to protect. So when someone invoked her name that day, as a rhetorical weapon, a way to undermine Jasmine Crockett's argument, it wasn't just disrespectful. It was historically tone-deaf, because Crockett, much like Ginsburg, has carved her path through skepticism and underestimation. A former public defender, and now a bold congressional voice, she's known for her sharp legal mind and unapologetic presence. Her critics often try to frame her as too emotional or too direct, but those labels echo the same arguments once hurled at women like Ginsburg, women who refuse to shrink in spaces built to contain them. That moment, when Crockett drew breath before invoking Ginsburg's own philosophy, was more than a debate exchange. It was a generational conversation. Ginsburg had once faced a similar courtroom dynamic, rooms full of men who doubted her authority but quoted her intellect when it suited them. She answered not with fury but with precision, the kind that reshapes the conversation without raising the temperature. Jasmine Crockett was channeling that exact discipline, that same poise anchored in purpose. Outside that chamber, the world watched a democracy wrestling with itself, between progress and resistance, between interpretation and inclusion. Social justice wasn't an abstract debate anymore. It was being lived, spoken, and challenged in real time. When Crockett spoke, she wasn't just answering a legal question. She was defending an ideal, that empathy and intellect aren't opposites, that passion doesn't cancel professionalism, and that quoting Ginsburg means more than name-dropping legacy. It means honoring the courage to dissent. That's why this moment mattered. It wasn't a clash of opinions. It was a quiet rebalancing of power, a reminder that every generation inherits the unfinished work of those before it. And as Crockett stood there, calm, deliberate, and unyielding, she wasn't just echoing Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She was continuing her sentence. Before that chamber moment, before the silence and the echo of Ginsburg's name, the stage had already been quietly set. For weeks, Representative Jasmine Crockett had been preparing for the hearing, not just with notes and citations, but with purpose. The topic on the table was weighty: accountability and governance, judicial integrity, and the interpretation of constitutional limits. It wasn't the kind of conversation where passion alone could win. Here, precision was power. Behind the scenes, Crockett's team knew what awaited her. They had seen the lineup of questions, many designed less to reveal truth than to provoke reaction. In the era of viral soundbites, women in politics often face a double burden. Defend your ideas, but never your tone. Crockett understood that better than most. She had learned it in the courtroom, standing between the accused and a system designed to break them down. She'd learned it in law school, reading about Ginsburg's early cases, the ones where equality wasn't a given, where logic had to pierce prejudice like light through stained glass. So she came prepared, not just legally but emotionally. Her notes carried citations from past Supreme Court opinions, including United States versus Virginia, 1996, where Justice Ginsburg wrote that skeptical scrutiny must apply to any law that denies opportunity based on gender. That line mattered to Crockett. It wasn't just legal philosophy, it was personal affirmation. On the other side, those preparing to challenge her had their own strategy. They knew that Crockett's strength lay in composure, so they aimed to disrupt it. A subtle interruption here, a loaded phrase there. Small acts meant to unsettle her rhythm and feed the narrative of being too reactive. The irony. That tactic had been used for decades against Ginsburg herself. In her early court appearances, male judges often tried to dismiss her arguments with humor or paternalism, but she never snapped. She waited, then dismantled them with surgical calm. That's the lineage. Crockett drew from the quiet resilience of women who refused to lose their footing in rooms that doubted their right to stand there. In Bis Appendienst Simon, the days leading up to that session, she had reread several of Ginsburg's dissents. One in particular lingered, her dissent in Shelby County versus Holder, 2013, where Ginsburg warned that rolling back voting rights was like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet. It wasn't just poetic. It was prophetic. Crockett had highlighted those words, not for rhetoric but for grounding. Because she knew what she was walking into wasn't simply a policy debate, it was a cultural one. Our test of whether truth could still hold its place amid political theater. That morning she arrived early, no entourage, no grand gestures, just a steady stride and a folder under her arm. Staffers whispered, cameras clicked, and the tension hummed like electricity before a storm. Every step, every breath, carried the awareness that moments like this didn't just happen, they were built. Layer by layer, word by word, and while others came to challenge her argument, Crockett came to defend something deeper. The idea that law, when spoken with clarity and courage, could still move people. She didn't know it yet, but before that day was over, her voice would do exactly that. The hearing began like any other. Formal introductions, carefully worded statements, the rhythm of procedure keeping everything in line. But beneath the veneer of civility, tension moved like static. Everyone in the room could feel it. Representative Jasmine Crockett sat poised, her notes open before her. She didn't fidget. Didn't scroll through her phone. Her gaze was calm, deliberate, the kind of calm that comes from knowing your ground before the first question lands. Then came the pivot. A senior member of the opposing committee leaned forward, his tone measured, but laced with condescension. Representative Crockett, he began, I think we can all appreciate passion in these discussions, but as Justice Ginsburg herself once said, the law must be guided by reason, not reaction. It was a calculated opening, using Ginsburg's legacy to undermine Crockett's credibility. The implication was clear. She was emotional, impulsive, out of her depth. The same coded dismissal women in power have faced for generations. Crockett let the words hang for a moment. Then she smiled, and just slightly. That's an interesting quote, she replied, her voice even. Because Justice Ginsburg also said that real change happens one step at a time. And she spent her life taking those steps, even when people mistook conviction for emotion. A few heads lifted. The room was beginning to shift. The chairman interjected, cutting her off mid-sentence. Let's stay focused on the legal matter at hand, he said sharply. But Crockett wasn't derailed. Her tone remained steady, her words deliberate. With respect, Mr. Chairman, she said, that is the matter at hand. We're not just interpreting policy, we're interpreting justice. And if we lose sight of the human cost of law, then we've lost the law itself. A murmur rippled across the chamber. Someone from the back, a younger representative, smirked. Well, that's a poetic way to dodge the question, he said, clearly trying to provoke. Crockett turned to him, not defensively but thoughtfully. "I'm not dodging anything," she replied. "I'm clarifying it. Justice isn't poetry, Congressman. But it is principle, and principle only matters when it's applied evenly." Her words cut through the air like a scalpel. Clean, sharp, undeniable. Reporters started scribbling. Cameras zoomed in. The energy of the room was no longer casual. It was charged. The senior member tried again, leaning on formality. "Well then, Representative Crockett, since you seem to speak for Justice Ginsburg, perhaps you can tell us whether she would have approved of this level of political theater." That line landed with intention, dismissive, baiting. Crockett paused. You could almost see the calculation in her eyes, a flicker of restraint followed by resolve. She closed the folder in front of her. "No need for notes now. Justice Ginsburg didn't believe in theater," she said quietly. "She believed in precedent. And precedent tells us that ignoring facts in favor of optics is how justice erodes." A small silence. Then she leaned forward slightly. "If quoting her name is just a way to silence women who speak, then maybe we're not honoring her legacy at all. Maybe we're repeating the very problem she spent her life confronting." That line landed hard. The chairman shifted in his seat. For a second, no one spoke. The stillness wasn't awkward. It was reverent. Even those who disagreed with her felt the truth of it. Crockett continued, now with quiet intensity. "Justice Ginsburg once said, 'Fight for the things you care about, but do it in a way that will lead others to join you.' That's what I'm doing here. I'm not fighting against anyone in this room. I'm fighting for what this institution is supposed to stand for: equal protection, equal respect, and equal accountability." It was no longer just a debate. It had become something else, a reckoning. A few members of the committee tried to steer the conversation back to technicalities, but the energy wouldn't settle. The audience, the aides, even the cameras, everyone was leaning toward Crockett now. Her words had changed the gravitational pull of the room, and perhaps the most striking thing, she never raised her voice once. When she finished her statement, she leaned back in her chair, calm again. The opposition tried to regroup, framing her remarks as emotional rhetoric, trying to reclaim ground through procedural jargon. But the audience had already felt the shift. They had seen in real time what composure under fire looked like. It was the same composure Ginsburg had once shown in her early years on the bench, when surrounded by skepticism. The same poise that transforms pressure into clarity. As the hearing went on, the talking points blurred, but Crockett's words stayed, not as sound bites, but as anchors. By the time the session adjourned, something subtle had changed. The power dynamic had tilted, not through dominance, but through dignity, because sometimes the sharpest weapon in the room isn't a raised voice. It's the refusal to be reduced, and that's exactly what Jasmine Crockett had just demonstrated. The tension that had built through the hearing reached its quiet peak. It wasn't chaos or shouting that filled the space. It was something more profound, a stillness charged with awareness. Everyone seemed to understand, even if they couldn't say it aloud, that the room had shifted. But then came the question, the one that would define not just the hearing, but the conversation beyond it. A different committee member, perhaps sensing the shift in tone, tried a subtler approach. "Representative Crockett," he said, "since you reference Justice Ginsburg so often, let me ask you directly, do you believe passion should play a role in the law?" His voice was measured, almost disarming, but the question was layered. On its surface, it sounded academic. Beneath it, it was a trap. Passion, in political language, often becomes a coded word, one used to question credibility, to pit intellect against emotion. The room waited. Crockett didn't answer immediately. She let the question breathe, her eyes tracing the table, the microphones, the waiting faces. When she finally spoke, her tone was calm, but her words cut deep. "I believe justice without passion," she said slowly, "is like law without conscience. You can enforce rules, but you can't build trust. You can interpret words, but you'll miss their meaning." The words settled like dust after a storm. She leaned forward, her voice softening. Justice Ginsburg wasn't passionate because she was emotional. She was passionate because she was human. She knew that fairness doesn't live on paper. It lives in people. And if you strip the humanity out of law, you don't have justice anymore. You have control. It wasn't the answer they expected or wanted. It wasn't defensive or deferential. It was reflective, grounded, undeniably true. The questioner blinked as though unsure how to respond. He tried to regain footing. But surely representative passion can cloud reason. Crockett interrupted, not sharply but decisively. No, bias clouds reason. Power clouds reason. Passion fuels purpose. And purpose is the reason any of us should be here at all. That was it. The room broke into low murmurs, some surprised, some approving. Even the chairman, who had spent much of the hearing maintaining order, sat quietly, his expression unreadable. And then she added something that would echo far beyond that day. When Justice Ginsburg spoke about dissent, she said, she wasn't just talking about disagreement. She was talking about responsibility, the duty to speak when silence becomes complicity. That's not passion out of control. That's conscience under pressure. And we need more of it, not less. You could almost feel the collective exhale. In that moment, Crockett wasn't just answering a question. She was reframing an entire argument, shifting the conversation from one about temperament to one about integrity. The power dynamic flipped completely, and not because she had out-argued anyone, but because she had revealed the truth they'd been avoiding. That empathy and intellect aren't opposites, they're allies. Her words echoed through the chamber in the same way Ginsburg's once had, precise, unhurried, deeply moral. It's rare in politics to see a moment that feels uncalculated, where someone speaks not because it's strategic, but because it's necessary. That was one of those moments. When she finished, the silence returned. Not the awkward kind and the kind that follows realization. Even those who disagreed with her couldn't deny that something profound had been said. In the back rows, a few aides exchanged glances, the kind that silently say, "This moment will replay on screens tonight." Crockett leaned back slightly, her expression neutral. She wasn't seeking validation. She didn't need applause. The impact was already there, in the unspoken respect that filled the air. It was then, in that quiet, that the true weight of Ginsburg's legacy revealed itself, not in citations or slogans, but in courage. The courage to answer not what's asked, but what's meant. And with that, Jasmine Crockett had done more than respond to a question. She had redefined the conversation itself. When the gavel finally came down, signaling the end of the session, no one moved right away. It was as if the room itself needed a moment to absorb what had just happened. Cameras blinked back to life, reporters hurried to their phones, and the buzz of whispered reactions replaced the silence that had defined the hearing's climax. Jasmine Crockett didn't linger. She gathered her papers neatly, quietly, and walked out through the same door she had entered. No triumphant smiles, no victory poses, just the kind of calm that comes from knowing you've said what needed to be said. But outside those walls, the world was already responding. Within hours, the clip of her exchange began spreading across social media, first among political journalists and law students, then into wider public conversation. Some saw it as a rare reminder of what authentic political discourse could sound like. Intelligent, grounded, human. Others tried to twist it into part of the daily partisan cycle, another skirmish in the endless online war of talking points. But regardless of the spin, one thing was undeniable. People were listening. News anchors replayed her line about justice without passion being law without conscience. It appeared in headlines, quoted on talk shows, dissected in op-eds. Legal scholars noted the deliberate echo of Ginsburg's own reasoning, not imitation, but evolution. Even conservative commentators, some of whom had been quick to dismiss Crockett in the past, admitted that her composure had been disarming. She hadn't raised her voice once, yet she had managed to shift the tone of the entire hearing. In classrooms and online forums, students compared her approach to Ginsburg's early oral arguments, those moments when calm precision won more ground than outrage ever could. A professor from Columbia Law described it best. She didn't use Ginsburg's legacy as armor, she used it as a mirror to reflect the gaps we still haven't closed. Meanwhile, inside Congress, the aftermath was quieter but equally telling. A few lawmakers who had dismissed Crockett before began to take notice. Some approached her directly, offering private words of respect, small gestures that hinted at recognition if not agreement. But Crockett wasn't chasing acknowledgement. Her focus was already shifting to the bigger picture: legislation, hearings, the ongoing work of justice. For her, that moment had never been about winning an argument. It had been about reclaiming a principle, that empathy, when grounded in knowledge, is not weakness, but strength. Outside, ordinary citizens began sharing their own stories in response. Lawyers, teachers, activists, people who had once been told they were too emotional for professional spaces, saw something of themselves in that exchange. It became a touchstone for quiet strength, for persistence without performance. And through it all, Ruth Bader Ginsburg's words resurfaced, circulating once again across timelines, classrooms, and public debates. Quotes from her dissents appeared next to Crockett's own, not as comparisons, but as continuations. The thread between generations of women who understood that the truest form of dissent is still measured, still principled, and still necessary. The ripples reached far beyond Washington. They reached into conversations about representation, about what it means to be professional, and about the double standards that still govern how women, particularly women of color, are perceived in power. It was a small moment in the vast machinery of government, but its echoes lasted because they reminded people of something simple and rare: the power of words spoken with conviction, not for applause, but for truth. And in that sense, Ruth Bader Ginsburg's voice really did reverberate, not as a relic of the past, but as a living influence carried forward by someone brave enough to answer back. In the weeks that followed, the noise of politics carried on as it always does: new hearings, new headlines, the constant churn of debate. But somewhere beneath all that motion, something quieter endured. People remembered, not the clash itself, not the tension or the tone, but the truth that had broken through it, that justice stripped of compassion becomes machinery. That law, when disconnected from conscience, loses its humanity. For Jasmine Crockett, the moment wasn't an ending. It was a continuation, a reaffirmation of why she had chosen public service in the first place. Her words weren't meant to go viral. They were meant to hold ground, to remind both her colleagues and the country that intellect and empathy can coexist, and that one without the other leads to imbalance. In a sense, it was a passing of the torch. Ruth Bader Ginsburg's influence didn't vanish with her absence. It evolved, finding new voices to carry it forward. Crockett had become one of those voices, not by imitation but through understanding. What she demonstrated that day wasn't just legal mastery. It was moral clarity, the ability to stay rooted when others sought to provoke, the discipline to use words as instruments of precision rather than weapons of retaliation. And perhaps that's the lesson that lingers, that leadership isn't always loud. Sometimes it's measured. Sometimes it's found in the moments when silence follows, not because people disagree, but because they're processing. The hearing will fade from headlines, as they always do, but the echo, that will stay. In classrooms where law students study advocacy, in quiet offices where young women prepare for their first big argument, in every space where conviction meets resistance. Because what Jasmine Crockett reminded, the world, through poise, courage, and respect for those who came before, is that the work of justice is never finished. It's inherited, carried, and renewed by each generation, willing to keep speaking when it's easier to stay silent. And that is where legacy becomes lesson, and lesson becomes action. Long after the lights dimmed and the headlines moved on, that exchange remained, not as a viral clip but as a reminder. History doesn't always turn on revolutions or rulings. Sometimes it turns on a voice, calm, clear, unwilling to bend. Jasmine Crockett's words didn't just honor Ruth Bader Ginsburg, they continued her. Two women, generations apart, joined by an invisible thread, both challenging a world that often mistook conviction for defiance, both proving that strength can exist without volume. That's how truth travels, quietly at first, then steadily until it becomes undeniable. In a time when outrage fills the air, Crockett's restraint became its own form of rebellion, a lesson in how integrity outlasts spectacle. Because when words are grounded in purpose, they don't fade, they echo. And if you listen closely, you can still hear it. In classrooms, in courtrooms, in every space where someone dares to speak with both heart and reason. Custom. Quote, True justice doesn't shout to be heard. It endures long enough to be remembered. That's how Ruth Bader Ginsburg spoke. That's how Jasmine Crockett responded. And that's how truth continues, one steady voice at a time.